So this morning, we're continuing on in our series in Leviticus, and we're picking up where Grant left off last week. Did Grant do a good job last week or what? Yeah. Those of you guys that were here, amazing job last week. I've heard nothing but phenomenal stuff from Leviticus 16. For those of you that haven't been here, we are studying the Old Testament book of Leviticus, one of the strangest, most unusual books in all of the Bible, the most ignored book, the most complicated, the most technical, weird thing that we ever approach in Scripture. And we just thought, for fun, why don't we do that? And so we've been having fun the past, 8, 9, 10. Some of you, you're like, it's like a year. It feels like weeks that we've been doing this. But we've been unpacking this book of Leviticus in all of its strangeness, all of its weirdness. One of the things that we've been discovering, or two things that we've been discovering through this, is that God uses this book to really explain some things and shed light on what we see in much of the Old Testament. There's two phrases that we've been repeating over and over again. I hope they're starting to catch up with you and you're starting to remember these. But we've been talking about how Leviticus reveals a God who is not like other gods, in the context of all sorts of gods and mythologies, a God who's revealing himself and saying, I'm not like the other gods that people worship. I'm not like the other mythologies that people practice. I'm different. We're seeing that emerge in the book of Leviticus. Not only that, we're seeing him form a people who are not like other people. Now, the how, there's a kind of a how dynamic to this. When we think about how God is doing this, it's really fascinating to see that God in Leviticus is using a language that people understand. He's using sacrificial systems that were common to people. He's using rites and rituals and symbols that people were familiar with in order to communicate with them. And that's what much of the first several chapters of Leviticus are about. God saying, hey, you're familiar with this stuff, but I'm going to use the things you're familiar with to tell you about who I really am in light of what you think about who God is. And so that's what we've been seeing. So God has used their language to tell them about who he is. That's the how of learning about a God who's not like other gods. There's also a how about how people become a people who are not like other people. And that question, that idea of how we become those people is what we're looking at today. Now, that question, how, I know that if you've been at Summit any length of time, you know that we are perfectly comfortable asking questions. And questions, we believe here, are what help us understand who God is. And so a lot of times we ask the why, we're asking the what, but today we're really getting at the how. How is God creating a people who are not like other people? We're answering that more specifically today because as we move on in Leviticus, today Leviticus 17, and we're going to bundle with that 18, 19, and 20 because those four chapters go together very nicely. When we move to these chapters, God begins to deal with the specific behaviors of the people of Israel. He starts getting very specific. Some people might call it meddling, but God begins to talk very specific, not about who he is, but now about who they are and how they would become a people who are unlike other people. The reason that's an important complex, the how and the why and all of them becoming different, is really based on the context in which we find the book of Leviticus or where we find the people of Israel when we pick up this book and start to study it. There are some key things I think we need to be reminded of. First of all, we need to be reminded of the kind of world that this book was entering into and that the people of Israel were actually living in. If you have someone in your life that watches too much news, which all of us have that person in our life, right? Some of you are those people, stop it. But if you know people that watch too much news, you've probably heard that person say something like, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, right? Like if you watch too much news these days, you find people who are saying, the world has never been worse than it is right now. You hear anybody say that? You know anybody that's like, oh man, it just feels like things are getting darker and darker and I don't think the world's ever been as bad as it is right now. They go on and on. If you hear somebody say that, here's what's true about that person. They know nothing about the time in which the book of Leviticus was written. Because if they think this is dark, it is pure white compared to what these people were living in and the conditions of humanity at this time. The world at the time of Leviticus, of the exodus of the people of Israel, was a wicked, dark place. It was the most perverted place. It was a gruesome, brutal world. People manipulated their power and took advantage of people. Slavery was rampant. Genocide was a regular monthly habit. People were wiping out entire tribes. It was incredibly violent. Sexuality was unchecked. Incest was a dominant theme among villages and families. It was an incredibly dark. If you imagine, the best thing I can imagine, when I think about the picture of how dark and gruesome things were during this time, I picture the most ridiculous zombie illustration from Hollywood that we've ever been given, like the most brutal, crazy, dark, wicked sort of primal place. And that is essentially the world in which the people of Israel are living. It is a primal, horrible place that they're living in. It is unruly. It is out of control. And the people of Israel themselves are a very primitive people, and they're being introduced to a very progressive God. They are primitive in that they're living in this culture, they're surrounded by these cultures, and they're being introduced to a God who is progressive in the sense that he's saying, I want to move you forward from this place in which you're living to a place of flourishing. I want you to live the life that I created you to live. So the tension that exists for these people is this. In Leviticus, we have the people of Israel exiting 400 years of slavery, right? So a few generations of people have been living in slavery. They've never been masters of their own lives. They've never made decisions for themselves. They've never really had to shape their own culture, their own laws, their own way of living. So they're released. Around 1 million people. That's the number. Around 1 million people are released, and they go into the wilderness, right? And they're moving into this land that God's promised them. And as they're moving through the wilderness, they have no idea how to conduct themselves. If you don't know how to live, where do you look? You look at the people around you, right? Like, we understand this to be true. This is a principle that's true, that things are caught, not taught, right? We learn that as parents, we learn that the hard way because our kids sometimes catch things that we wish they didn't catch from us and really just listen to our words instead of our actions, right? But we catch things more than we teach things. And so the people of Israel coming out of Egypt, their knee-jerk reaction, their first response to how to live life is to look at the people around them and to model their lives after them. So in Leviticus 17, what we begin to get is specific instruction on how to not be like the people who live around you, on how to be a people who are unlike other people. So quickly, I'm going to summarize these chapters. Again, they all go together. They all sort of link together. And then we'll talk about how we actually change. How do we become people who are not like other people? How does that actually take place? And why is that important? Why is that an important thing for us to understand in our culture? Chapter 17. In chapter 17, we have very specific instructions for what you do when you're hunting and you kill an animal, which is good news for like a third of us in the room, right? So it starts out, and basically it's this. Basically, God says, listen, if you're out and you kill some sort of animal, there was such a tendency for people in those moments to immediately worship some other god. So like if you killed a rabbit, you would now worship the god of rabbits by like sacrificing the rabbit and worshiping him out there in the wilderness, and then you would take the food back and feed your family. That was like another weird thing that people did. And God says, listen, if this sort of stuff happens, if you're out hunting and you kill some animal, I don't want you to associate provision with anybody but me. And so when that happens, this is chapter 17 basically, I want you to bring that animal to me, to the priest, to the tabernacle, and I'm going to bless it. And he gives the details on how to do that. It resembles a lot of what we've read in the earlier chapters of Leviticus. Along with that, he's saying, I don't want you to worship other gods. I don't want you to be like other people and have all of these pagan rituals and all of these idols that you're worshiping. So that's chapter 17. Don't do that stuff. Chapter 18, he moves on into sexual issues, into sexuality. In fact, the people are given instructions around sexuality that I think in many ways are very practical for us. Because we try to keep Sunday mornings as PG-13 as possible, I'll move through this as innocuously as I can. And I won't be throwing seed at any eggs this morning for those of you that have been here. I had too many parents after 2 weeks ago say, thank you for that. I had to explain to my children what you were doing because they didn't get it and they needed to. So chapter 18, those of you that weren't here, go watch online. It's ridiculous. I don't even know what I was thinking. But chapter 18, every now and then you have a really bad idea and then you act on it. Chapter 18, it deals with very specific things about sex and sexuality, and it's an important thing for us to note that for these people, in the same way it is for us, sex was not a simple issue. Sexuality, there are multiple dimensions to sexuality, and Leviticus notes that in the ancient world, just as it is in the modern world, sex is never simple. Sex is always complicated. Sex is about power. Sex is about pleasure. Sex is about procreation. Sex is about money. Sex can be about marriage. Sex can be about intimacy. All of those things can be wrapped up into sexuality. And the writer of Leviticus is writing these things and being very specific about how we conduct ourselves sexually. I could spend a significant amount of time time unpacking chapter 18, but the point of chapter 18 is very, very simple. What the text demands is that very specifically the people in positions of influence and the men in the Hebrew culture, that they and their households would exercise sexuality in a way that was distinct from the Canaanites, from the Egyptians, from the various people that lived in the lands around them. So God draws these boundaries and says, listen, I want you to conduct yourselves different sexually, specifically those of you with the ability to use your authority sexually or to use sex manipulatively. So it's very much what chapter 18 is about. Then chapter 19. Chapter 19, God starts to sort of spread out and expand his topics. He talks about revering parents. He talks about honoring the Sabbath. He talks about worshiping idols and revisits part of 17. He puts a welfare system in place. In fact, the same welfare system, if you're familiar with the Old Testament story of Ruth and Boaz, if you've ever heard that story, the welfare system that Ruth benefited from in her story was the one established in Leviticus chapter 19. So that happens here. God starts talking about how we treat one another as this contrast community, as a people who are not like other people. He starts to talk about things like theft and fair wages and legal processes. Why? Because they didn't have these things, right? They were living in this very barbaric, very dark time. And for the first time, this is revolutionary. Like, he's talking about how you live towards your neighbor, and it's so different from what anybody else has ever heard before. In fact, it's in Leviticus 19 that we hear something Jesus repeats during his teaching ministry. Verse 18, he says this, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall" what? "Love your neighbor as yourself." So way back then, and this is what you got to understand, this whole idea of people being not like other people, that didn't originate with Jesus. That originates way back here when God's drawing the people of Egypt out, and he's saying, I want you to live differently towards each other. I want you to love each other. I want you to care for each other. I want you to do justice for each other. I want you to live in a way that is distinct from other people around you. You're going to be different. In chapter 20, God goes into further detail about idolatry. In fact, he addresses head on in almost an entire chapter the practice of child sacrifice. And he says, this is abhorrent. It'll never be allowed. God's dealing with all these things. He's setting them apart. He's distinguishing them. And through all of it, there's sort of a question that can sort of arise in this. How do we deal with God telling us about specific behaviors? Why is God telling us to be different in these ways? And how do we process this? Like, what is this all about? Why is God doing this? Well, verse 22, sort of all of these chapters culminate at the very end of chapter 20. And verse 22 says this. It says, "You shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my rules and do them." And here's why. "That the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out." Pretty clear, right? Like, we talk all the time about how the Hebrew language is poetic. We don't always say it's beautiful, right? The Hebrew word for vomit here is vomit. Just so you know, right? Like, it's vomit. You don't need me to go into a lot of detail, but the picture's being painted like, listen, God's saying, listen, I love you and I want what's best for you. One of the reasons I'm asking you to be unlike other people is that if you just continue in these ways, your life, it'll be as if this land in which you live is vomiting you out. Like, you will live so disconnected in your existence that it'll feel as if the land is vomiting you out. Have you ever made a decision? Have you ever made a choice? Have you ever gone down a road where the consequences of that decision felt like the land was vomiting you out? Anybody besides me? Right? God says, listen, this is about you. Like, this is as much for you as it is for me. I want you to live a life of flourishing. I want what's best for you. So how does this happen? Then he says something else really interesting in verse 24. Talk about something that's fascinating, and you see all of the parts of the Bible weaving together in moments like this. Verse 24, he goes on and he says, "I have said to you." When he says said, he's referring to something in the past, right? He's saying, listen, I'm going to remind you of something that I've already said. So what is about to follow is a reminder for the people of Israel. And the question is, what is God reminding them of? What's he talking about when he says this? He says, "I've said to you," remember this, "you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess a land flowing with milk and honey. I'm the Lord your God who has separated you from the people." So he's quoting something, right? God's quoting something. He's saying, guys, listen, I want you to do this, and here's why, and then here's another thing I want you to remember. This is what's going on. I've separated you, and this is what I've told you in the past. Well, what was he telling them in the past? And how is that going to transform them? See, that's the issue at hand here. The issue is transformation, right? I'm going to transform you. You are going to be a different people. Here's what's challenging about this. Whenever we start talking about transformation, or we start talking about people being different, especially around church and church culture, there is this baggage that seems to come along with this, right? Because as soon as we talk about being different, as soon as we start thinking about the rules and the instructions that God's giving in Leviticus 17, 18, 19, and 20, we start to think about guilt, right? We start to think about how we motivate that change. Well, we do it by guilting people, right? The church, by the way, has like a PhD in guilt, does it not? Like, we know how to guilt people. Or maybe you change people by shaming people, right? Or maybe you change people by putting fear in them, by intimidating them. Maybe if you can make people so insecure that they're dependent on God, then they'll obey him. That's sort of the way we think, right? We have this tendency to associate, well, when the Bible says we need to change, it's going to be motivated by guilt, shame, fear, intimidation, all those sort of things. That'll become out of insecurity. Here's the problem with that. If God is using fear and guilt and intimidation and shame, if he's leveraging your insecurity, how does that make him a different God than all the other gods? See, every other god that people worship, every other idol that people put themselves in submission to, operates on and controls us by guilt and shame and fear and intimidation. It was true of the gods people were worshiping then. It's true of the idolatries that we worship in our culture today. Those things manipulate us based on shame and guilt and fear, insecurity, intimidation. So if God's using those methods, well, how is he different than other gods? And not only that, if that's what we're being motivated by, then how are we different than other people? Because that's what's motivating everybody everywhere, right? What's motivating people in life in general is fear, shame, guilt, intimidation, insecurity. Those are the poisons of people's lives. So if God's supposed to be a God who's not like other gods, and we're supposed to be a God who's not like other people, then certainly when he's looking for transformation, he's not looking to accomplish it through those means. Are you with me in this? Which brings us back to this quote. Why does God quote this? He's quoting this because he's showing them another way to transformation. And it's one of the most unusual, crazy things you'll ever see, what God's referencing in this moment. But if you have a Bible, I want you to flip back to Genesis chapter 15. And as you're going to Genesis 15, I want to tell you a little bit about the individual that we're going to meet in Genesis 15. We're going to talk about Abram, later called Abraham. And Abram, his story starts back in Genesis chapter 12. And where his story begins is with God approaching him and saying, I want you to leave the nation that you live in. It was Ur of the Chaldeans is who Abram was known as. And so he says, I want you to leave this land of Ur, and I want you to establish a new life. And God makes Abraham all of these sort of vague promises about a land that he will inherit and a people that will bless the nations through his offspring. Like he's sort of alluding to some of these things. And God makes these promises to Abraham, and simultaneously, Abraham believes these things, but there's some question marks in his thinking. So he kind of goes on. He's like, okay, God, I get it. I'm going to believe you. He steps out in faith, and it's a really beautiful thing. God is making a covenant with Abraham. It's a beautiful agreement between he and God. In fact, the word covenant, just for a moment, the word covenant literally means, it means to cut. The word covenant means to cut. And so, like to cut with a knife and to make somebody bleed. That's what the word covenant means. In fact, this is how it's sort of worked itself out in our culture. Casey, if I liked your shirt, which I don't particularly like your shirt today, but I'm going to use you as an example because I saw you there. But if I liked your shirt and I said, hey, after the service, I'm going to give you I don't know, what do you guys think his shirt's worth? Like $100, his wife says, $100. I'm going to give you $3 for that shirt. After the service, we're going to cut a deal, right? We're going to cut a deal right now, and then after the service, there's going to be a transaction, right? We call that cutting a deal. When we cut a deal with each other, it comes from this word covenant. We cut a deal. Where in the world did this come from, right? Where did this come from? You're going to see it in these verses. How do we cut a deal? God is making a covenant with Abraham, but there's a problem. As time goes on, it seems as if Abraham isn't seeing God fulfill his end of the bargain. And so he starts to question, right? He starts to question, like, God, when is this ever going to happen? When are you going to ever fulfill your part of it? And in Genesis 15, we have this really unusual interaction of Abraham questioning God. And I want you to just listen to this. Verse 1, he says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. I love verse 2. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you've given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. He's saying this, he's saying, God, you made me this promise that you were going to bless the nations through me and that I'd have all these offspring. I don't have any kids. That's basically the summary. I don't have any kids, which means when I die, my name goes down with my death, and all of my possessions get handed to Eleazar of Damascus, this guy that works for me. He's going to get all my stuff. And so how are you fulfilling this? Are you ever going to fulfill your promise? Verse 4, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. In other words, I'm going to keep my promise. Don't give up. And then God does something really cool with him. It's a picture. And remember that the Hebrews used pictures because pictures were worth 1,000 words, right? And they were an oral culture. So he gives him a picture. Verse 5, it says, and he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars if you're able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So God reminds him of the promise. And then he said to him, I'm the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. And I don't know if you see what's being referenced here, but it's the very same thing that was being referenced in Leviticus chapter 20. I've given you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? I love this. I love this for the honesty. I love this because Abraham says, God, I get it. I know. I see your promises. I think you've been really clear with what you're promising. I just don't know how in the world it's ever going to come true. I don't know what the guarantee is that you're going to come through. Do you ever have those moments when you feel like God has promised you something, when you feel like God's spoken into your life, when you feel like God has promised you renewal or hope or life, and you're like, God, when are you going to come through with this? I love that Abraham is so vulnerable with God. He just says, God, I get it. I understand what the promise is. I just don't see how it's going to happen. And then God does something in verse 9 that is so strange and so weird that I can't believe that we don't talk about what happens here more because it's such a beautiful picture that God paints. Like Abraham's like, God, how do I know that you will keep your promise? Check this out. Verse 9. He said to him, God says to Abraham, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and I want to say a partridge in a pear tree, but he brought a young pigeon, right? So God says, bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. Now check this out. Verse 10. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. So he cuts these animals in half, and he basically makes like a trail, like with half of a ram here and half of a ram there, and half of a heifer here and half of a heifer there, right? He lays all this stuff out and cuts them in half. And there's something really interesting about this. God says, bring me the animals, but he doesn't tell him to cut them in half, does he? So something's going on here, right? There's something strange. God says, bring me the animals. And Abraham says, okay, I brought you the animals. And then he starts sawing away, right? Like, what is going on? Like, this should cause us to ask questions, right? Why is this happening? God didn't tell him to do this. And it seems like he's maybe going beyond God's instruction, right? Why is this happening? Abram is doing something that everybody at that time would have understood. This was a language that people spoke during this time. Abram didn't live in a written culture, which means there were no lawyers and there were no contracts. So when you cut a deal with somebody, the only way that you could communicate your commitment to the deal was to paint a picture that told a story of what would happen if somebody breached the contract. And so what was typically the case, what typically happened, is that two people would bring animals and they would cut the animals down the middle, just like he's done here. And then the two people, so Casey with his shirt and me on the other end, we would be at either ends of this, and we would know there's a deal that's going to take place. And when the service is over today, I'm going to give him $100 and he's going to give me his shirt. And to prove that we're going to keep our deal, we would walk between the dead animals. This was what people did. They would walk. Now, usually it wasn't over a shirt, right? It was usually something a little more significant than that, but that's just the best example I could come up with in 10 seconds. So they would walk through this, and as they walked through, they would pass by each other, and they were making a statement, not just to each other, but to the community that was watching, that if either one of us breaks this covenant, so shall our lives be like these animals that have been split, the flesh being torn and being torn apart, losing your life. Basically, they were saying, listen, my word is my life. I will give my life if I break my word. So this is a serious moment. So Abraham, when God says to him, bring me a heifer, bring me a ram, bring me a goat, bring me the turtle doves and a pigeon, Abraham goes, oh man, I know what's happening. God, I questioned you, and now you and I, we're going to cut a deal. We're going to make a covenant. We're going to make an agreement, and you're going to tell me your part, and I'm going to tell you my part. That's the assumption that he makes. He has no idea what's about to happen next. Verse 12. So he laid the animals out, and he's just there, right? Okay, God, let's do this thing. Let's make the deal. And verse 17 says, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking pot and a flaming torch. And I know this doesn't make sense, but it will in a minute. A smoking pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. So you have a smoking pot and a flaming torch. And he's like sitting here watching this. He's not at one end or the other. He's watching this smoking pot and flaming torch move between the pieces. And verse 18 says, on that day, the Lord made a covenant. So the Lord made a contract. The Lord cut a deal with Abram saying, to your offspring, I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. That's what's being referenced in Leviticus chapter 20, right? Is this deal that was being cut. But what's the significance of this smoking pot and flaming torch? The Hebrew words that are translated into our language, smoking pot and flaming torch, they're the exact same Hebrew words that are used to describe the presence of God at the top of Mount Sinai when Moses went up and received the Ten Commandments. The exact same words that are used to reference the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke that led the people of Israel, God's presence leading them out of the land of Egypt when they were coming out of slavery. So what we're reading about is the presence of God moving between the pieces. And why is this significant? It's not just the presence of God that astonishes Abraham. It's the fact that the presence of God passed through alone. What does this mean? Instead of Abraham walking through the pieces and sealing the contract himself, saying, these are the consequences if I break my end, God does it singly. He does it on his own. Why is that significant? It's significant because there are always two problems in this conundrum of faith. There are always two problems. One problem is with us, right? One problem is with us and our ability to trust God, right? We trust God, but then we say, God, how do I know? How can I be committed or know that you're committed to me? How can I know that you're going to keep your end of the bargain? That's what Abraham was wrestling with. That's what we wrestle with in our faith, right? God, how do I know that what you are calling me to, what you're challenging me with, can actually be trusted? That's part of it. How do we know that we can trust God? And what we see in this, God resolves that part of it, right? He resolves his end of it. He says, listen, I have promised to bless you, and I have promised to be your salvation. And if I don't do what I'm telling you I will do, then my immortality will suffer mortality. He's saying, listen, if I don't keep my end of this, then my infinity will suffer limitation. If I don't keep my end of this, my power will suffer powerlessness. The impossible will become possible. He's saying, listen, if I don't keep up my end of this, I will be cut off. I will be destroyed. My body will be ripped to pieces. That's what God says to Abraham. He says, if I don't keep my part, then I will subject myself to this. So that answers one part of the faith conundrum. But then there's the other part of the faith conundrum, and that's our own failures, right? So the other question, the other challenge is we say, well, God, what if I don't keep my end of it, right? Isn't that what religion's always about? Me keeping my end of the deal? God, what happens if I don't keep my end? What happens if I get distracted? What happens if I just kind of wander? What happens if I just seem to slide away from you? Then what happens if I get forgetful or I'm just not as passionate for a season of my life? God, then what's going to happen to me? And do you know what the picture tells us and tells Abram in this moment? By walking through that on his own, God says, not only will I bear the responsibility for me, but I bear the responsibility for you. In other words, he's saying, if you don't keep up your end of the bargain, then may my immortality suffer mortality. May my infinity suffer limitation. May my power suffer powerlessness. May the impossible become possible. May I be cut off. May I be destroyed. May my body be ripped to pieces. He says the same is true whether you keep the deal or not. I'm still holding myself responsible. Does this sound familiar? Does it not sound like the gospel being communicated in the middle of Genesis chapter 15? See, salvation for Abraham, salvation for all of these people, it is not a cooperative effort. This is not a partnership. This is not a place where I agreed with one part of it and God agreed with the other. It is completely 100% God. God comes through and says, I will take the curse of the covenant regardless of what you do. I will bear responsibility for both parties in this. This is unheard of. He's saying, Abraham, I'll be cut off if you don't keep your part of it. That's what this is about. And if I don't keep mine, you don't keep yours, I bear the weight of responsibility. I will bless you even if it means that I would have to die. Fast forward to Mark chapter 14, verse 22. Jesus is sitting in the upper room with his disciples. It's the night that he'll be betrayed by Judas, and they're sharing the Passover meal, and Jesus says this. As they were eating, he took the bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to them and said, take, this is my body. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and then all drank of it. And he said to them, this is my blood of what? The covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. He says, listen, this is the new covenant. Jesus is getting ready to die, and he's sitting with his followers, and he says, this is the new covenant. This is a covenant that is renewed. It's better. Is Jesus referring to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15? In John chapter 8, he's talking to a group of Jewish listeners, and as he's speaking to them, he says, your father Abraham looked forward to this day and rejoiced. Because this is a picture of God keeping his end of the bargain whether we do or not. That's what this is about. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 8 says something Abraham couldn't even comprehend, and it speaks of God himself. He was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. I was stricken for my people. It was predicting the very thing that God was showing Abraham all the way back in Genesis. God would suffer. God would be cut off. God would be trampled. Do you see this in this? So Abraham, he comes and he says, God, I need to trust you more. And God didn't say, how dare you? No, God says, I want you to look at my promise, and I want you to see that it's bigger than you. When the man brought his child to Jesus and asked for him to heal him, and Jesus said, well, do you have faith? And he said, I do, but help my faith. Help me believe. Did Jesus rebuke him? No, he healed him. If you go to God and you say, God, I don't know. I don't know if I trust you enough. I don't know if it's deep enough. But will you help me? God will help you. He will point you to the gospel. He will point you to his commitment to you, not your faithfulness, his faithfulness. And he'll show you, I did this for you. So in Leviticus, in the book of Leviticus, when we see that there's this new community, this contrast covenant community of people, he's not telling them, I want you to do this or else. He's saying, listen, I want to remind you of the covenant that I've made with you. I want to remind you of my grace upon you. I want to remind you that I love you regardless of whether or not you love me back equally. He's saying, listen, I want you to live, and the motivation for them, I want you to be motivated by what I do for you, not what you do for me. I want you to be motivated by my love, by my grace. He's saying, I want you to follow my example. In the same way that God goes from a position of power to a powerless position, to the same way that God submits himself, subjects himself, he says, I want you as a contrast community. Don't leverage your power. Don't seek authority. Serve, love, care for one another. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of this, he's saying, would you follow my example and live sacrificially towards other human beings, lovingly, full of grace? Would you give grace and not judgment to people? Would you be these kinds of people? That's what he's calling him to. And he says, you're moved towards that by my grace, not by fear, not by insecurity, not by shame and guilt. Because it's grace that makes us a people who are not like other people. It's grace. It's when we realize that we can be supremely confident in the love of God, that we become people who are no longer insecure. It's when we know that God has our backs, that we don't have to judge those around us or seek their approval. There's something that changes in us when we are coming face to face with the grace of God. This morning, we're going to close by taking communion together. And what we're doing when we take communion together is we're acknowledging the new covenant. We're recognizing that God always keeps his end of the bargain. And when you and I sit here and we hold the bread and the cup, it's this reminder, like this is what God has done for us. This is what God continues to do for us. We see his grace and we're compelled by it. It changes us. In fact, the Apostle Paul was writing to the church and he said this. He said, when we do what we're about to do, when we take the bread and the cup and we remember Jesus together, he says that we ought to examine our hearts. What are you examining for? We're examining our hearts to see whether or not we are a contrast people, a covenant people. Are we changed by the gospel? Are we loving or are we judging? Are we confident or are we insecure? Are we living towards others the way that God has lived towards us? That's what we're examining in our hearts. So Jesus tells us, he says, take the bread, take the cup. There's something about holding them in your hands and looking and saying, man, am I being transformed by this? Am I so aware of God's love and his compassion and his mercy that this changes me, that it makes me a different kind of person? Am I that kind of person? He knew that a physical thing in our hands would have to be reckoned with. And so this morning, that's what we're going to do. We're going to sing a song, and if you want to sing, that's great, but I want to challenge you to examine and just think, am I living like a person who's not like other people? Am I transformed by the grace of God? Am I aware of the fact that God always keeps his end of the bargain and he's bringing flourishing and hope and life to me and inviting me into a different sort of existence? So we're going to pass the elements out right now, and if you'll hold them a couple of minutes, I'll come back up and we'll take them together.